morning. It was a decade ago this morning when, on a sparkling, beautiful September day, the United States suffered the darkest day in its modern history. This morning, as we look live down upon ground zero, as you can see, deep scars remain here. Tens of thousands of people have gathered here to witness this and remember. Thousands of them are family members who suffered the worst possible loss on that day. They're gathering as well this morning at the Pentagon, remembering another awful attack from the air that day. And in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where still another hijacked jet crashed into a field after a heroic group of passengers fought to take back that aircraft, preventing another attack on Washington. For the next 3 hours this morning, we remember the staggering loss 10 years ago today.
This is an NBC News special. America Remembers. Reporting from Ground Zero in New York, here is Brian Williams.
And good day to you all. It is a somber occasion, of course, made more poignant by today's weather. It is, again, a beautiful, crisp, and clear September morning. Of course, everyone alive back then, and we assume so many of you are joining us today because of your memories of that day, will remember what September 11th was like, especially for those here in New York. Down on the ground, the ceremonies will be beginning soon. Things are happening like members of the New York Emerald Society are getting together and posing for a picture. Those are the bagpipers, the drum corps, who were so busy, such a sad task they had. Police officers, firefighters, funerals after September 11th. We'll have two United States presidents here, and then, of course, our coverage will go on the two other locations across the country. Along the way, we'll show you the memorial that has opened here. We'll show you the thousands of people who have gathered. With us this morning is a man who was with us that morning for, 100 hours afterwards in the anchor chair, Tom Brokaw. Tom, thanks for being here.
Brian, it was, as you said, the darkest day in modern American history, and it set off a chain reaction that continues to this day, and we have to remember that on this occasion as well. Moreover, for the first time, the attack on America was carried live on television. It seemed surreal at the time, and it seems surreal again as we watch those images.
Terrifying. I'm in shock right now. I heard a boom, looked up, and there was a big ball of fire. I'm stuttering because I'm in such shock. I've never seen anything like it. It's just horrible.
That was when the 21st century truly began.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on the shot.
It literally blew itself into World Trade Center.
Apparently, it felt just a few moments ago like there was an explosion of some kind here at the Pentagon.
What we have is something that most Americans thought could never occur. The Federal Aviation Administration has shut down all air traffic nationwide. This country has been immobilized by these terrorist attacks in terms of air travel today, and we don't know where it goes from here.
Their immediate reaction in a case like this would be to look toward Osama bin Laden and the collateral groups connected to him. He is the one terror leader who is capable of this kind of highly coordinated attack.
I need you to step back.
there's going to be massive amounts of casualties.
Imagine the confusion and the terror that is in that area after not one but both Trade Center towers have now collapsed.
This is war. This is a declaration and an execution of an attack on the United States.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
We have this report from AP that I'm just simply going to read. A large plane crashed Tuesday morning just north of the Somerset County Airport, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
The most powerful nation in the world, and national security officials and terrorist experts have been saying for some time, a small band of very willful and sophisticated people can bring us to a halt, and they have done just that. It is hard to overstate the consequences of all of this, and this is just the beginning.
Of course, it was unfolding on live TV. For the longest time, we didn't know what we had here, how many prongs were there, and you summed it up saying willful and sophisticated. It was sophisticated, Tom, in that its simplicity. They used our own system against us with the expenditure of human life and just a few dollars of capital.
They punctured our innocence. We were not prepared for anything like that. We are a changed country because not just of airline security, but our intelligence services, the kind of warfare that we fight. 26 days later, we were at war in Afghanistan. We were at war against an insurgency, people who don't wear military uniforms and fight on front lines. So it did have a profound effect on this country. You were here, I know, in '93 when the World Trade Center was hit. They learned from that they could do it again, and they did. And the fact that we've not had another attack since then, I think is testimony to how this country responded to that very fateful day, Brian.
And of course, would you believe, and we all know now, a truck bomb went off yesterday in Afghanistan, injuring 80 U.S. service members. Well, yesterday we went down to the White House and I spoke with President Obama about the day 9/11, and he reminisced as to where he was and what he was doing. Mr. President, as the day arrives, what does the day on the calendar, 9/11, mean to you?
Well, you know, I always think back to where I was that day. Sasha had just been born. I mean, she was only a couple months old, so we were still in diaper changing mode and burping mode. And I still remember it was gorgeous in Chicago, just like it was in New York. We were driving down Lakeshore Drive. I was driving down to go to a meeting in the State building, and heard the first report about a plane going into the towers, and assumed it was a Cessna or somebody who'd had an accident. By the time I parked my car, got into the meeting that I was attending, the reports were starting to come in that this had been a jet liner and that many people had been killed. At that point, we started evacuating the building, and then going to my law office and watching, the towers come down, and the images of people falling from the skies, and the clouds of smoke and dust settling on everyone, and then going home and holding Sasha, rocking her to bed as I was watching the reports of what had happened. And I think that for me, like for most of us, our first reaction was, and continues to be, just heartbreak for the families involved. The other thing that we all remember is how America came together. And so 10 years later, I'd say America came through this thing in a way that was consistent with our character. We've made mistakes. Some things haven't happened as quickly as they needed to. But overall, we took the fight to Al-Qaeda. We preserved our values. We preserved our character.
And yet, you hear that? You think about it differently now? It's just a jet going in a national airport. Here we are surrounded by the machinery of office.
Right.
You're this is your home base, and yet they consider you at your most exposed. Right. It was a game changer, and it remains that we will always listen to that sound differently now.
Well, you know what? There's no doubt that airports are a lot more inconvenient. Pennsylvania Avenue shut down. But what I'm struck by is how much continuity there is. There are folks who are still working in office buildings in Manhattan. New York is still this incredibly vibrant, dynamic place full of diversity. Immigrants are still pouring in from all around the world because they want that piece of the American dream. The truth of the matter is that there have been some changes since 9/11. Some innocence perhaps has been lost. But our core values, our core character, how we interact with each other, our love of this country, and our ability to work through difficult issues in a way that's peaceful and democratic. Those things haven't changed, and that's a testimony to the strength of the American people.
That was just yesterday afternoon at the White House and the portico separating the residents from the West Wing. We want to show you a live picture. 2 U.S. presidents, current and former, 2 U.S. First Ladies, current and former, greeting family members alongside one of the 2 pools, the waterfalls, that now mark the footprints of these buildings. They have entered this plaza area. There's a small group waiting for them, and each of them getting a personal greeting. The first emotional moment of a day that promises so much of that. We'll take a break. When we come back, our conversation with former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. As we look at the live scene, again adjacent to one of the 2 waterfalls, the 2 pools, and you can hear the whoosh, the noise of the water. You see former President George W. Bush and President Obama talking with some of the children of 9/11. Many of the loved ones are arranged there. The President and Governor Christie of New Jersey just had a nice moment together, and there, of course, Mrs. Giuliani. And there's the former mayor. As we look at the former mayor greeting the president, I want to show you a conversation we had moments ago with former Mayor Giuliani. During this conversation, we may dip in and out and show you the live pictures of what's going on down at the plaza level. Mr. Mayor, welcome. Thank you for coming here. I know this is, well, where to begin to describe your emotions on this day. I was in a bookstore the other day in New York and saw one of the many books published about 9/11, and the title was something like A Decade of Hope. And to be honest, I don't see it that way. It's been a struggle. The area is not done. This is still a big scar. We're still paying for it in many other ways. Look at this threat level right now. How do you see it?
Well, I probably see it somewhat the same way, but I expected it to be that way. So expectations mean everything. A couple of days before I left office, I wrote a speech about the future and gave it at St. Paul's. And I think I said in the speech, it may take many years to figure this out, because I knew the burning conflicts, the tremendous emotions. You have your view from having been down here of what should be. I have my view. Probably doesn't quite match exactly what's there.
Right.
Well, there are thousands of those.
Yeah, no 2 people are going to.
Well, it took over, I think, 10 years for Oklahoma City. So having that expectation, I'm kind of okay with. They did a pretty good job. It's about where I think it could be. And I don't think we're through this, because the struggle still goes on. I mean, after all, we're celebrating the anniversary, the bravery and the overcoming of this attack, and we're under threat of attack again. So it's a reminder that this still goes on. This whole thing that caused this is still going on, and it may arguably be stronger or not as strong, but it's still going on.
Talk to me about Michael Judge that morning. Really a face like an angel on earth, and I know you You had some words with him before you learned that he didn't make it.
You know, last night Judith and I were at a mass at St. Patrick's for the firefighters, and Father Judge's picture came up. He was the first one that died, and I see exactly where I spoke to him the last time, right behind that bridge there. I was rushing toward the fire command post right there, and I saw him, and I grabbed out, I reached his hand, and I always said to him, Father, pray for me. And he always said to me, no, it's more effective if you pray for yourself, because it's more unusual. Always kidded around. Great sense of humor. No sense of humor this time.
Yeah.
Stone face. Never saw that before on him. And it was my first real sign that this is much worse than anything. And then 2 hours later, when I was in the command post, I was informed that he had been crushed, probably giving the last rites or comforting someone, and his body was being carried to St. Peter's Church. A true saint. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. The man was a saint. He was at the deathbed of 25 firefighters with me. He knew how to explain death to people, which is quite an art.
Yeah. Of course, if you got through that day, what else can life throw at you, really?
Well, there's a contemplation that has helped me through many difficulties since then. When things seem annoying at business or in politics or personal life, you just say to yourself, wow. And I'll remind people that sometimes. They get too excited. I said, this is nothing like what the people went through on September 11. It's true. It gives you a sense of perspective, which is why I think the city is stronger. This is a stronger city today than it was 10 years ago. Remarkable fact. More people live here now than before.
That's true.
Twice as many people live here. So the terrorists aren't scaring them.
Mayor Giuliani,
thanks, Mark. Thanks for the coverage. It's beautiful. Thank you.
Great. Our conversation earlier with former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. During the conversation, again, you've been watching some of the live pictures going on. Two families, the Bushes and the Obamas, walking through the plaza, greeting some of the other families of 9/11. We'll work in a quick break here. Our coverage will continue right after this. At 8:36 a.m. this morning, the ceremony gets underway here in New York. But of course, this is a three-pronged day of remembrance. The moderator of Meet the Press, David Gregory, my friend and colleague, is covering things down at the Pentagon this morning. David, good morning.
Good morning, Brian. This morning, a heavy day, both in the air and also in the tone around the Pentagon as we prepare for memorial here as well to honor those who were lost on 9/11 as a result of the attacks here. The American flag unfurled over the west side of the Pentagon, outside that E-ring where the damage was done from Flight 77 10 years ago. It's striking. I was listening to you earlier, Brian, talk about the scars that remain at Ground Zero in New York, and here with the military efficiency within a year, that scar, that hole in the side of the Pentagon was repaired so quickly as, of course, things were in motion. War planning had not only begun but was already being executed. It was also, I think, a sign of the difference in scale between Washington and New York in terms of the sheer loss of life. President Bush was here yesterday to lay a wreath at the site of the attack as the memorial got underway. That, of course, reminds us of 10 years ago and the morning after the attack, the president back in Washington and came to visit that day as well. We remember the audacity of the attacks, Brian, this morning against our center, the very center of our military might, which took many people not just by surprise but horrified them further.
Absolutely. David Gregory heading up our coverage on, as he mentioned, a heavy day, both in the air and concerning the mood at the Pentagon. David, thanks. And of course, as we get ready for the remembrance ceremony to begin, we'll take a break, come back with that right after this. Back here from New York, a sunny September day. We have some thin, light clouds at a low altitude passing overhead, but mostly it's a blue sky, sunny day. Two presidents, Bush, 43, and Obama, two first ladies, are looking at the memorial here. It's kind of a campus setup, but make no mistake, in the middle of what is still a construction site. And then we're getting ready, of course, for the memorial. Our coverage of America Remembers continues here on NBC. And we're back from Ground Zero in New York. I'm joined this morning by Tom Brokaw. And Tom, Rudolph Giuliani has said that this commercial building, this massive building, which will be the tallest in the United States when it's done, has no place here. He's against it. Others have expressed, and as a New Yorker, I want to get your opinion, frustration that this is still, a decade later, a construction site. David Gregory said at the Pentagon, while they were planning two wars, they got their problem all fixed up, and the Pentagon looks back to normal now. What do you make of this? Is it a symptom of anything larger, and what does it say about us?
It's New York, is what it is. I mean, no construction site, even getting a closet built in an apartment, takes 2 years and a lot of specifications, and everyone has an opinion. Everyone had an opinion about this, all the families, all the political people. Actually, I think that they've done pretty well, all things considered. I don't think the mayor is wrong about the commercial building at this site. I think it's also worth reminding our viewers who are not familiar with New York, they thought just 2 trade towers came down. This is a 16-acre site that was demolished. There were 7 buildings in the World Trade Center. I came down the Saturday afterward, and I was just stunned by the magnitude of the violence. 16 football fields of collapsed buildings and steel and debris. I think that 10 years later, Brian, this is probably a restart, that we'll begin to think again about who we are and where we're going and what this site ought to represent. I was here the other night taping for Dateline, and they were working through the night on that construction site trying to get things done. So New York is in a constant state of renewal, and this is another representation of that.
What do you think of the theory that the most effective memorial might have been that last surviving shard of 10 stories of that violent-looking, kinetic-looking building?
I think that might have been too traumatic to look at constantly because it was such a reminder. You know, a memorial is always a difficult thing to do, and we don't know how effective it is until time goes by. Take the Vietnam Wall. When it went up, a lot of people said that's just a scar. That's not representative of who we are. And yet, it's like a magnet when you go to Washington. You're drawn to those names.
Our coverage will be back right after this. Here at Ground Zero in New York on a sunny September 11th morning, 10 years after the darkest day in modern American history. We've been chatting with members of our NBC News family. You're looking at the memorial here at Ground Zero, and the reason we don't see right now the Obamas or the Bushes, they're looking at this new and very solemn facility. Our colleague Lester Holt is with us with his own look at what has gone in here. Lester, good morning.
Good morning, Brian. I want to talk about the transformation we've seen behind us. It's incredibly remarkable, but the challenge of rebuilding and the question of how do you erase the ugly scars of the attack while at the same time not erasing the memories of those lost, that was difficult, but many think they've done a terrific job.
There were times we couldn't look away, and times it seemed we couldn't bear to look anymore. But the gaping physical and emotional pit that became the icon for a national wound has slowly been erased.
Yeah, I thought I was going to see that big pit that I saw on the news a couple years ago.
And while curious eyes these days are drawn upward at the rapidly rising tower known as One World Trade Center, unseen to tourists and passers-by until now, the 9/11 Memorial.
Black reflecting pools framed with waterfalls where the Twin Towers once stood.
This is sacred ground because of the loss that was suffered here, which is...
Joe Daniels is president of the National September 11th Memorial.
A terrible fact that should never be forgotten is that 40% of all the victims of 9/11 from the World Trade Center were never found. That means 40% of all the families never got to go through that traditional rite of burying the dead.
I can tell you it's incredibly emotional to walk up to these pools for the very first time, to see the footprint of exactly where the building stood, and to see the thousands of names etched in bronze.
The bronze panels surrounding the pool bearing the 2,983 names have been finished for weeks. Paula Berry, who lost her husband on 9/11, was among those who helped choose the design.
I do hope it is therapeutic, and I hope when people do come, they are able to either punctuate or feel differently about their grief, or it moves them in a certain way. And I think that's for all of us. It's not just for family members.
Everything from what kind of memorial to what kind of office tower should rise here has been mired in controversy these last 10 years, and feelings still run strong.
We've ended up with a central building of supreme banality, I think. It's a large glass block on a rock.
I feel it would be better off if they left the scar in the ground as a reminder of what hatred can do.
Planners say that story and the events of 9/11 will be told in the 9/11 Museum going up next to the memorial.
I'll tell you that the day after the 10th anniversary, we're going to reset our countdown clock that we have in our office for 365 days, so that on 9/11/2012 is when we open the museum 1 year later.
And Brian, they continue to try to balance the need to get construction moving with sensitivities. There were signs up during construction saying, please don't photograph the names. They really wanted the families to not see them on Facebook or Twitter, but to see them with their own eyes on this very day.
And of course, debuted, and then there were automatic weapons in front of the names because of this threat we're under.
It's just so bizarre. I mean, and that's why many people, we're not at the end of a chapter here. We just continue to live these days past 9/11. I'm reminded every day that some things just don't change.
And at the same time, it's home to you and me and our families, and this is a part of the fabric of New York now. And so interesting to hear architecture critics. Tom was right. It's New York, and everyone has an opinion.
Everyone's got an opinion.
Lester, thank you. Good to see you. As we look at some of the scenes here in New York and the Emerald Society, the bagpipers and drum corps taking its position, a third part of today is Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Tamron Hall is there covering for us today. Tamron, good morning.
Good morning, Brian. The ceremony is just starting. We're hearing a children's choir perform. And yesterday it was an amazing scene. Thousands of people dealt with the awful weather conditions to come to this destination to pay their respects to those on Flight 93, those 40 heroes. In attendance, you had President Clinton, President Bush, as well as Vice President Biden here. And this is what you're looking at. This is what was unveiled yesterday. It's a wall, an 8-foot granite white wall, and it includes every name of the passengers and crew members who fought back on that morning. And it was just a sense of serenity, a sense of pride, but obviously a somber mood as well. And another thing that was unveiled yesterday, Brian, just over my right shoulder, about 200 yards from where we're standing, is a boulder, a 17-ton boulder that marks the exact spot where Flight 93 crashed into the ground. It's hallowed grounds now. Only the family members are allowed to walk on that ground. But alongside is a beautiful black walk path. And everyone who comes into this now national memorial will be able to walk along the edges and look over and see where that boulder is located and where those heroes died that day for this country. So again, the ceremony is starting right now. We're expecting the governor of the state, as well as, of course, the president of the United States will be here later this afternoon. Back to you, Brian.
Tamron Hall, thank you. Tamron Hall in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The memorial ceremony here at Ground Zero is going to start to begin with the Brooklyn Youth Chorus. They'll be performing the national anthem. And then you will hear and see New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who will lead the ceremony in this city to the first moment of silence. We'll just pause here and take some of this in as it unfolds.
Fold. Move. On guard. Positions. Move.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?
Position. Move.
Honor guard, present. Halt!
We're going to remain silent when this does happen, but we're inside 2 minutes here. 8:46 will mark the impact of the first aircraft.
Ten years have passed since a perfect blue sky morning turned into the blackest of nights. Since then, we've lived in sunshine and in shadow. And although we can never unsee what happened here, we can also see that children who lost their parents have grown into young adults, grandchildren have been born, and good works and public service have taken root to honor those we loved and lost. In all the years that Americans have looked to these ceremonies, we have shared both words and silences. The words of writers and poets have helped express what is in our hearts. The silences have given us a chance to reflect and remember. And in remembrance of all those who died in New York in 1993 and 2001, at the Pentagon, and in the fields near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, please join in observing our first moment of silence.
God is our refuge and strength, a very present help
in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling, there is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. He makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge.
They were our neighbors, our friends, our husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, children, and parents. They were the ones who rushed in to help. 2,983 innocent men, women, and children. We have asked their families to come here to speak the names out loud, to remind each of us of the person we lost in New York, in Washington, and Pennsylvania. And they each had a face, a story, a life cut short from under them. As we listen, let us recall the words of Shakespeare. Let us not measure our sorrow by their worth, for then it will have no end.
Gordon A. Amath, Jr. Delimero Abad. Marie Rose Abad. Andrew Anthony Abate. Vincent Paul Abate. Lawrence Christopher Abel. Alana Abraham. William F. Abrahamson. Richard Anthony Acito. Heinrich Bernard Ackerman. Paul Aquaviva. Christian Adams. Donald Leroy Adams. Patrick Adams. Shannon Lewis Adams. Stephen George Adams. Ignatius Udo Adanga. Christy A. Adam. And my beloved son, Joshua Todd Aaron, we miss you and love you forever. You're always in our hearts.
And my sister, Marlene Capito Bautista. We love you and we miss you. You are always in our hearts.
Terrence Edward Adderley Jr.
Sophia B. Addo.
Lee Adler.
And Tom, this is the reading of the names, and sadly, just because of sheer necessity, we're talking about almost 3,000 people. This is going to take quite some time. Volunteer readers, family members, and this is the kind of thing we've seen on each anniversary. It is the saddest kind of roll call in the world, and as members of the New York community, over the years, you end up coming to know these families so intimately.
Well, what has been so striking to me, I've been spending time with them again, is their determination to live their lives in a more meaningful fashion now. A number of the widows have remarried, for example. Some who have not say they still talk to their husbands. Marion Fontana, who gained some attention because of her ability to write, gets fixed up on a blind date, and then at the end of the evening looks to the sky and says to her husband, "Was this your idea?" So after 10 years, in many ways, they are coping with it better than you might expect. You know, it's remarkable that more than 1,100 bodies have not been identified or found, any remains of them. And those that were able to be identified, it was just a fragment of DNA in many instances. They've got a battered fire helmet back or a piece of a credit card or a ring, and that's all they had because of the utter violence of that day. So I think the rest of us can really draw strength from these families and the meaning that they bring to these occasions. When they read those names, I'm sure that there are a flood of great memories that come back to them, and the dimensions of the loss, only they can know.
Here in New York, it's not uncommon to read in one of the local papers, say the New York Daily News, a small box item in the middle of whatever week saying that at a construction site or on a rooftop in New York, they have identified more human remains, or the medical examiner's office, after 10 years of research, has identified another name. It's absolutely extraordinary.
We were talking just earlier this morning. I was here on December 7th because we were tying it to Pearl Harbor and overlooking the site. And that day, down in the pit that has been filled in some now, they recovered 4 bodies, and the rituals were that everything would come to a stop. It would be the honor guard of the firemen or the policemen, and they would bring the remains, in many cases just that, out in a very ceremonial and reverential fashion. At the end of that day, I was so drained I could barely move emotionally, and I think most of the people that were working with it as well. But now, after 10 years, these families are determined to get on with their lives. I think that they're helped as well by their relationships with one another. There's been a bonding. They've worked together on compensation issues, on security issues, and there's the second generation of firemen coming up and policemen coming up, children who've decided that they want to follow their fathers into the service.
So much of today brings back so much from 10 years ago and the subsequent years and anniversaries and those grim, awful days and nights. It became known, Ground Zero did, as the pit. It became a calling. It became a talisman for the people working on it. And we should quickly add, 52 lives have been lost since the initial loss of life. Many people will tell you because of the toxic nature of what they were exposed to in that pit. And we should also hasten to add, of course, the obvious. This is one of 3-pronged remembrance today. The other, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and the other at the Pentagon in Washington, where my friend David Gregory is heading up our coverage. David?
Brian, I've been thinking about the chronology of this morning, which of course was the chronology of the morning of 9/11/2001, and at this point, within 10 minutes of the attacks, for our government at that point, how difficult those minutes and hours, days and months and years would become. I'm with Karen Hughes, who was, of course, President George W. Bush's top advisor, his counselor on that morning. And Karen, you were not with the president in Florida because September 10th is your wedding anniversary. So you were here in Washington. Can you bring us back to how uncertain these moments 10 years ago were for you and for the government?
Well, I just remember the complete shock and horror. I was, as you say, in Washington, and I was actually at home because I was scheduled to represent the White House at another event, and my assistant called me from the White House and said, Karen, a plane has hit the World Trade Center. And of course, like many of us, I thought a small plane, and I turned on the television and called my deputy traveling with the president in Florida, and I watched in horror as the second plane crashed into the the second tower as so many Americans did. And I remember telling him, Dan, another plane has hit the second tower. And of course, at that moment, we all knew it was no longer an accident. And he said, what kind of plane? And I said, I don't know, a big plane, like a passenger plane. And I don't know why, but it never occurred to me that there were actually passengers on that plane. I knew it looked like a big plane, but perhaps it was too horrible. And I just remember dropping to my knees and saying a prayer for those people. It was just, and then I felt this great sense of responsibility. You know, I knew I had to get to the White House as soon as I could. I was talking by phone with the president and his staff in Florida until Air Force One took off, and we lost contact with them for a while. And that was one of the very frightening moments of the day for me when I tried to call, and the White House operator said, ma'am, I'm sorry, we can't reach Air Force One.
And for a new administration, just 9 months into the president's first term, there had to be an overwhelming sense of, what do we do now?
Well, I was actually struck, you know, as watching on television, the White House was evacuated. I was on the phone with my assistant, and she said the Secret Service is yelling at us to get out of here, and I said, go. And the Pentagon was hit, and the State Department was being evacuated. And I remember this sense that it looked very chaotic, and yet when I arrived, the Vice President sent a military driver to get me, to bring me back into Washington, which was, of course, at that point being shut down. And when I got to the Emergency Operations Center, I was struck by the very calm and methodical decision-making that was taking place. Planes were being grounded. The Transportation Secretary, Norman Mineta, was overseeing that. The Vice President was consulting by telephone with President Bush. But of course, we all knew in that moment, everything had forever changed. The President's presidency, our country.
We were talking earlier this morning. You remembered the crowds, the throngs in New York City on that Friday after the attacks, when the presidential motorcade that we were both a part of passed by, that unity. You remarked about this morning how important it is to see President Obama and President Bush side by side. And yet that kind of unity is not what has marked the past 10 years, or certainly our current political climate. How do we reckon with that?
Well, I think it's still there. I just think it's beneath the surface. These have been years of enormous anxiety, mostly the last recent ones because of the economy and the difficult situation so many Americans find themselves in without jobs. But I also think that the enduring lesson of September 11th is that it brought out the goodness in each of us. We saw the good in each other. We talked to strangers standing in line. We saw the heroism of those brave firefighters who went into the danger and up toward the inferno. We saw the heroism of our military who went into battle, many of whom had enlisted in a time of peace and found themselves in a time of war, others of whom signed up to serve knowing the threat and knowing that they would be deployed. And so we saw that bravery, we saw that goodness, and I think in that we saw the greatness of our country. And sometimes it may seem a little beneath the surface, but I think it's there, and I hope our leaders will call it forth.
Karen Hughes, thanks so much for your memories this morning. Brian, we are at the Pentagon, and it's worth remembering the stark importance. This is where the war really began after these attacks.
David, thank you. And next up here, the next moment of remembrance will come at 9:03. And remember, that's when United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower of the World Trade Center. The bell will ring twice. Then we'll hear from former President George W. Bush. Tom, again, in real time. On television, we were dealing with the picture and the reality that the building had been struck, and then along came that second impact. That changed everything because we knew what this was.
Yeah, there was bewilderment before that, and there was an urgency. People said something has happened at the World Trade Center. The hole was so large, it didn't seem to me that it could be a small plane. I was en route to the studio at that point. Heard Art Athens, a well-known New York radio reporter, say a plane has just flown over Washington Square and it's flown into the South Tower. And I knew then that we were at war, very likely, that this was a deliberate attack of unimaginable proportions.
Absolutely.
You know, we were talking about the Bushes a moment ago. The Friday before the attack, Mrs. Bush had a book festival, and the week before that, they had the state dinner for the President of Mexico, and she said to me later, I thought that's what the presidency was going to be all about. 9/11 changed it for everyone.
And people forget forget how new the presidency was of George W. Bush. Don't forget we were coming off the hotly contested election, and then everyone came together, of course, in the wake of this. We're going to return to the reading of the names because this will pause and then turn into the second moment of silence ceremony to mark the time when the second aircraft impacted.
Timothy D. Betterly,
Carolyn Mayer Bug,
Edward Frank B.A.,
Paul Michael Bayer,
Anil Taharam Bahavani,
Bella J. Buchan,
Shimi D. Beagleson,
Peter Alexander Bielfeld,
William G. Biggert,
Brian Eugene Bilcher,
and my brother-in-law, Stephen Howard Berger. We all miss you. There's not a day that goes by that we don't think of you. You'll always be in our hearts. We love you.
And my brother, William Reed Bethke, we will always remember you.
Mark Bingham,
Carl Vincent Beanie,
Gary Eugene Bird,
Joshua David Birnbaum,
George John Bishop,
Chris Romeo Bashunda,
Jeffrey Donald,
President Lincoln not only understood the heartbreak of his country, he also understood the cost of sacrifice and reached out to console those in sorrow. In the fall of 1864, he learned that a widow had lost 5 sons in the Civil War, and he wrote her this letter. Dear Madam, I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you're the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Yours very sincerely and respectfully, Abraham Lincoln.
My name is Peter Negron. My father worked on the 88th floor of the World Trade Center. I was 13 when I stood here in 2003 and read a poem about how much I wanted to break down and cry. Since then, I've stopped crying, but I haven't stopped missing my dad. He was awesome. My brother Austin had just turned 2 when he passed. I've tried to teach him all the things my father taught me: how to catch a baseball, how to ride a bike, and to work hard in school. My dad always said how important it was. Since 9/11, my mother, brother, and I moved to Florida. I got a job and enrolled into college. I wish my dad had been there to teach me how to drive, ask a girl out on a date, and see me graduate from high school. And 100 other things I can't even begin to name. He worked in an environmental department and cared about the earth and our future. I know he wanted to make a difference. I admire him for that, and I would have liked to talk to him about such things. I've decided to become a forensic scientist. I hope that I can make my father proud of the young men that my brother and I have become. I miss you so much, Dad.
Listen to Yo-Yo Ma, the schedule calls for the gates of the memorial to be opened to family members. And so this is what you're seeing, family members who have waited a decade for this opportunity. Yo-Yo Ma has completed, and now the roll call of names continues.
Carrie Rosetta Blackburn.
Susan Leigh Blair.
Harry Blanding Jr.
Janice Lee Blaney.
Craig Michael Blast.
Rita Blau.
Richard Middleton Blood Jr.
Michael Andrew Bacardi.
John Paul Bocci.
And my father, James Patrick Berger. We love you, Dad. Me, Nick, Al, and Mom will never forget you.
And my father, John Tay Nazo. Dad, Mom, Jewel, and I miss you. You are forever in our hearts. Rest in peace.
Michael L. Bocchino.
Susan M. Bocchino.
Dira Francis Bobley.
Bruce Douglas Bone.
Nicholas Andrew Bogdan.
Darren Christopher Bohan.
Lawrence Francis Boiseau.
Vincent M. Bolin, Jr.
Tari Hamzavi Balorchi.
Alan Badodurenko.
Andre Bonor Jr.
Colin Arthur Bonnet.
Frank J. Bonamo.
Yvonne Lucia Bonamo.
Sean Booker Sr.
Kelly Ann Booms.
Canfield D. Boone.
Mary Jane Booth.
And my father, George John Bishop. We love you, Dad.
And my dad, firefighter Christopher Joseph Blackwell, Rescue 3, FDNY.
Sherry Ann Bordeaux.
Christine Bordenabe.
Jerry J. Borg.
Martin Michael Borshevsky.
Richard Edward Bosco.
Klaus Bota.
Carol Marie Bouchard.
J. Howard Bolton.
Francisco Eligio Boudier.
Thomas Harold Bowden.
We're back here at Ground Zero, and I'll state the obvious for each of these readers. It is just an aching process because, of course, they represent names that are tied to survivors and family members in the crowd. The families are, for the first time today, coming to see and touch and experience these names on the wall. Just a highly emotional day and experience, including for our next guest, Janelle Guzman McMillan. She did not know that she would bear this title at the time, but she turned out to be the last person rescued from the World Trade Center after 27 harrowing hours, an employee of the Port Authority. Janelle, you're very nice to come down and talk to us today. I should tell our audience this is the first time you've been back here, and if it helps, keep looking at me and not behind us. It's a powerful sight, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a
lot of emotions.
10 years, but everyone has said the same thing today. It's just like nothing.
To me personally, just seeing the site again bring back a lot of memories, and I just can't believe I'm actually here. But I think I'm getting closure.
You wrote in your book that in the rubble, where you were resting on top of a firefighter in whose coat you used. Just an incredible thing. And of course, in your memory, it must take nothing to bring yourself back there. That image is with you when you close your eyes each night.
Yeah, it's something I have to live with for the rest of my life. I see it, just like it just happened yesterday. And being under the rubble, I can't believe it happened. I can't believe I'm actually here. And I know it's part of the reason that I'm here, to tell the story and let people know the experience that I've been through.
If memory serves, the name of the dog who latched onto your scent was Tracker?
Tracker, yeah.
And tell us briefly, since it was all chaos and the walls came in on you, you find yourself in rubble, but also after doing a quick triage, there came a moment when you realized you're alive, and you had to pin your hopes on being found. You were found, you were taken out, you're okay. What happens in your life over 10 years? How does it affect your life?
Knowing that I was under that rubble and I was touched and someone hold my hand and bring me out of there. For the past 10 years, I'm so grateful. My life has changed so much in so many ways, spiritually, physically, emotionally as well. And for that past 10 years, I think about it, but I try to stay focused and just kind of get it off my mind, move forward in life, but it can't. It's always going to be a part of me. And I think about the rescuers, the firefighters, people who risk their lives trying to save me. And I'm forever grateful and indebted to them for finding me that day.
The firefighter on whose body you rested, one of 343 members of the FDNY. And you're right, they all were here because they were rushing in to save people like you and people they couldn't get to. You're a mother and a wife, and you have a robust life that continues.
Yeah, I got married to my boyfriend, and I have 2 other kids after 9/11. I attend the Brooklyn Tabernacle. I have I'm blessed in many ways, and I'm forever grateful for that. My life it's been a healing process, but I'm getting through it.
And Janelle, what do you think of what they have done here?
Well, this is very tremendous of them to do something like this. It's a declaration of the memories of the people who lost that day and so many other lives not unfound. And I really admire it. I love it. And I think it's something that we have to live with for the rest of our life. And that memory serves us just do the justice of what happened that day.
And of course, to those of us who grew up in this area, it's still striking that there's nothing
behind
in this space. This was your workplace. This was your world, in addition to being the World Trade Center.
I mean, seeing it today, I'm trying to recall where my building stood actually.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievable. I can't imagine. I just imagined that beautiful place before, but now it's all like so different. But yet I like what they're doing, rebuilding it, and it just gives me hope that we'll be all right.
So you like having the sight of this big gleaming tower going
I love the tower. I love what they're putting out there.
Mayor Giuliani doesn't. No 2 people have the same opinion. We all think different because it's New York City.
No, I think it's beautiful. I'm really commended that they put it back there. It's just, we got to face our fears and try to move on. And I think it reminds me of the family who lost their life that day. And I just want to remember it that way,
And aren't these waterfalls so much bigger and more beautiful in person?
Oh yeah, first time I see the waterfall, it's beautiful. It's amazing.
Well, we feel honored that I know it's been such an emotional time for you, and we feel honored that your first visit back here, I hope we didn't make it more painful on you, was to talk to us and share your experiences with our audience, and they can now read your experiences in your book, which will last for all time.
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm so happy to be able to talk to you and have you here. Thank you, Janelle. Of course, everywhere around this bit of real estate, there are incredible stories from that day. Take the firehouse that was always known here locally as the 10 House, New York City, FDNY, Engine 10, Ladder 10. They were among the hundreds of first responders who converged on Ground Zero that day. That's because it's the closest firehouse. It's just across the street from what was the base of the World Trade Center. And here are some of their thoughts in their own words.
My name is Vincent Geloso, work for New York City Fire Department, Engine Company number 10, Ladder Company number 10, veteran for 22 years.
My name is Sal Organo, Fire Department, New York, Engine Company 10, and been here 12 years. Couldn't make sense of what was happening. Before you know it, we were over at the battalion, getting on a bus, coming to the city with everybody from that area. And on my way down, just thinking about, by that time we knew the buildings were down, and we were just coming to do recovery, hopefully find somebody. Just trying to make sense of that much destruction. It was not easy to do. There was no rooms to search or areas to look in. It was just white dust and wire and metal. I couldn't make sense of anything.
Where do you start? Because it was just so big, you don't know where to start. We had firemen all over the city, firemen, in fact, all over the country, helping out that night, literally, digging and searching, pretty much, and literally not even tools, hands and buckets.
It took a while to get order. Guys are just frantically looking.
I had some pretty special connections with a lot of the guys. Paul Pancini was a police officer. I was a police officer. And right from the get-go, me and Paulie, we kind of gelled together. We were buddies. Lieutenant Atlas, who showed me a couple of little tricks here and there, which a lot of little tricks. And I got to say, I miss the guys. I miss them very much.
A lot of firehouses in the city made their own memorial. Obviously, we have the big one on the side of the building that welcomes everyone, which is really nice. It's unbelievable. But in this firehouse alone, we made our own special memorial, and it'll be there as long as the building's here. I still can't believe it's 10 years. It's, like Vinny said, it seems like yesterday that we were, cleaning up the front and still constantly cleaning every day. And 10 years later, the work's doing good. They're getting there. It's nice to see it out of the ground, pretty high too.
For me now, this firehouse represents every firehouse in the city. In fact, maybe every firehouse in the world. I mean, everyone comes here and shake your hand and just say hello. It's just understood, They don't not even say a word. It's just a look sometimes. This is home. This is home.
Right hard against what was the base of the World Trade Center, the firehouse they have always called the 10 House. Engine 10, Ladder 10, FDNY. And while those guys are modest, as you look at a live picture of its proximity, I was down there last night. I visited many times, and one thing that they're always too polite to point out, tourists, well-wishers, and this happens all over the city, especially at the house known as 54 and 4 in New York's Times Square. People mean well, and they stop by and they want to talk, and that means that every day for the last 10 years, the surviving firefighters, rookies included, at the 10 House have been forced to live in it, dwell in it, and they're allowed to escape only when they're inside in their kitchen or doing their jobs, answering an alarm. So it's a highly emotional business. They walk out their door and they see this abyss, which is now at least filled with the memorial, and the skyline behind it is filling up. Again, this is one of a three-pronged memorial today. We have the services ongoing at the Pentagon, and let's not forget Shanksville, Pennsylvania. My friend Tamron Hall is there heading up our coverage today. Tamron?
Brian, I'm so honored to have with me Patrick White. His cousin, Louis Joey Nackey, was one of the passengers who stormed that cockpit 10 years ago, fighting the four terrorists who'd taken control. It is such an honor to be here with you, and I've got to ask you, how do you feel 10 years later when you look back at the hard work that you and the other families put in to make this memorial a reality?
I'm very proud that we've been able to take the first step in creating such a fitting memorial. Our partnership with the Park Service, Park Foundation, and others is just one that has worked so well. We've created something here that is just a symbol to our nation that recognizes the heroism and their selfless sacrifice.
But it wasn't an easy road to follow. I mean, you put in thousands of hours. You helped in securing this land, 2,200 acres. It took 4 years just to get the land. And then right after the attacks, a year later, President Bush signed into law that this would be a national park. But this was not an easy road.
No, in fact, we had to go back and work with the Bush administration in its last hours on some agreements with one of the landowners, and literally came down to the wire at the end of President Bush's administration to be able to kind of help break that logjam.
It's interesting. We were walking around looking at the wall that has every name, all 40 there, and you see the boulder in the horizon. And with all of the media and the people who've turned out to show their respects, there's still such a sense of serenity. And I wonder to myself, how is that possible? But it was the goal of the families to make this a place where you could just sit and feel what happened here.
We were blessed, truly, that in Paul Murdoch Architects, we had someone who understood what it was that we were looking for in terms of the least being done to the land and yet to derive the most from it. The design focuses on the sacred ground. It amplifies and helps heal this land.
And there's still, though, $10 more million that's needed to finish the project. We heard President Clinton yesterday say that he and House Speaker John Boehner have an agreement, a bipartisan agreement, to try and raise that last $10 million. And you spoke with the former president.
I did. I had an opportunity to shake hands with him, and we looked each other in the eye, and I said that the families are expecting and know that you will honor that commitment, and we're so appreciative of it.
All right. Well, Patrick, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Tamron.
Tamron.
I'm going to give you a hug.
Thank you, dear.
Thank you so much. Brian, back to you.
Tamron, thank you. Emotional day. And we've been watching, I haven't referenced this, but you've been seeing it on television. These carved names are just now being unveiled. And so for the families and the hotel that is housing our NBC News team, our production team, is, for example, full of overnight guests, relatives, family members of 9/11. They are just arriving here in New York. I was with a group last night from New Mexico, and look at the rubbings that they are making, since this is the first time that they've been able to see and touch their loved one's name. So and it's happening times 3,000 here below us. We're going to be going to the Pentagon ceremony in a moment, and Richard Engel is here with us in New York, who is our chief foreign correspondent. I'm sitting here thinking, I think you and I met in Baghdad, but I really didn't know until just a moment ago where you were on 9/11. You were in Jerusalem.
I was. I haven't been in the United States very much over the last decade, and I think my experience has been reflective of
because of what happened?
Because of what happened here, and it's been reflective of what has happened to the U.S. military. Since 9/11, more than 2 million troops have been deployed overseas, and a lot of them doing multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Yes, I was in Jerusalem at the time of September 11th. One of the first reports that came out, it was incorrect, was that a Palestinian group was responsible. And this event here has changed not only the Middle East, but the United States and the world, perhaps permanently.
And we should probably point out, as we look at today's speakers, as we think about today, politics and geopolitics are right there in the background. Yes, today is about memories and sadness, but here's President Bush. Millions of Americans will always believe that while we started bombing in Afghanistan 26 days after what happened here, the first war we launched, people will always believe, was elective because Iraq had nothing to do with this.
Iraq had nothing to do with this, and that message is still lost today. The war in Afghanistan, most people think, was necessary. A response was appropriate because this militant group, Al-Qaeda, was being harbored by the Taliban. And the Taliban was driven from power in about 3 months from the September 11th attacks by just 400 or so, mostly CIA operatives. It was a largely covert war that cost $1 billion, lost one CIA agent in that, one CIA officer in that conflict. But then, not long afterwards, the United States shifted focus to Iraq. It was a much more costly endeavor, had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, and that had an impact on the military, had an impact on the original war in Afghanistan, and those two wars are still ongoing. U.S. troops are leaving Iraq at the end of this year, but U.S. troops remain in Afghanistan. And just in the last 24 hours, there was a major attack, a big truck bomb.
80 Americans injured.
Several tons of explosives blew up on this truck bomb in eastern Afghanistan.
It's hard to believe. Richard, we talk about the scars that are still visible. This is still a construction site, and the after effects continue around the world, even as we have this conversation. Our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, thank you.
My pleasure.
I'm happy to have you here today. Again, to the other prong in this, and that is Washington, the Pentagon, and David Gregory. David?
Brian, the ceremony at the Pentagon will begin momentarily. Dignitaries have begun to arrive. Some notables in Washington, as you would expect. Vice President Biden will speak. So will the chairman of the Joint Chief, Admiral Mullen. We've seen already gathering here former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who, of course, was the Secretary of Defense on that day 10 years ago. And the western facade that was attacked when Flight 77 slammed into the outer ring and penetrated 3 of the rings has been repaired, was repaired within a year, and now the American flag hangs over that side as Vice President Biden arrives. And we will, of course, mark a moment of silence here at 9:37 when the plane struck the Pentagon. I'm joined by Jim Miklaszewski, our Pentagon correspondent today, as on that day, as well as Andrea Mitchell, our chief foreign affairs correspondent today, as on that day. And Jim, I want to start with you. Brian has alluded to the visible scars at Ground Zero 10 years later, and yet, as I noted, with such military precision and efficiency, within a year, the scars were erased here, but of course they remain 10 years later.
Well, you know, that's right, and most Americans can set aside 9/11 and just observe it on these kinds of anniversaries. But for hundreds of thousands of American military, they live and die 9/11 every day. And as we heard from Richard Engel a moment ago, talking about what has become the endless war in Afghanistan, what's happening now is the Pentagon and military officials realize that time and money is running out, that there were some serious mistakes in prosecuting that war over 10 years now, and they realize that with President Obama's withdrawal date of 2014, that now, really now, they only have 3 years to get it right. But they have to get it right, they say, because that region, if it were to become destabilized, would present, according to military officials, just another breeding ground for the likes of al-Qaeda.
We are watching the presentation of the colors here at this military ceremony at the Pentagon. And Jim, if we go back to 9/11 10 years ago and your compelling, steady coverage on that morning, even after the plane hit the Pentagon, an amazing fact that I came across this week, the attack of 9/11 here that killed 184 people was 60 years to the day of the groundbreaking of the Pentagon, built as a kind of bunker, impenetrable, because no matter what's happening, this place doesn't stop and hasn't stopped. And the symbolism of hitting this place was very important.
No question about it. They were after the top military leadership. It was very fortunate that the plane hit where it did. If it had been around the corner, essentially, they could have wiped out the entire civilian military leadership for the United States. And the part of the building that they hit was under renovation. So there were far fewer people in that section of the building when the plane sliced into it. And therefore, 125, a very small number in comparison to the potential numbers had that been totally occupied. And I can tell you, having been here a while, this is a living building. I mean, and the way it was constructed back there just prior to World War II saved countless numbers of lives in this building.
Andrea Mitchell, there was, in watching some of the documentaries this week of that day, as horrific as the events were in New York, there was something about the isolation of New York at that particular time of the morning. And there was then something palpable that took it to another level of horror when you heard the Pentagon was burning. As Tom Brokaw described that morning and reprised again this morning, America was at war in an instant.
America was at war, and when we realized it after the second plane, and within minutes, sources were telling us, and we were reporting, that this could only be Osama bin Laden. And I had spent so many years covering bin Laden from 1993, the first attack on the World Trade Center, and a top White House official had said to me then in the White House, which I was covering, we dodged a bullet in 1993, and they didn't get on it. And so you had Democratic and Republican administrations clearly not grasping the nature of this after 1998, the attacks on our embassies in Africa, after the October 2000 attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. And so at that point, on 9/11, we realized this was war, and that changed our politics, our military spending, as Mick has said, and Richard Engel having covered it from overseas. It changed the nature of our society in so many profound ways. We can't walk around Washington and into public buildings, the People's House, Congress, and the fact that Flight 77 was most likely that Flight 77 hit here and Flight 93 was most likely heading toward the Capitol. We realized just how vulnerable we were.
We are going to pause for a moment as we approach the moment of silence coming up at 9:37, as we can take an image of the ceremony here at the Pentagon.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. Precious day that grace through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home.
As Archibald MacLeish wrote, there are those who say that freedom of man is free. They are right.
As we listen to Amazing Grace at this Pentagon ceremony, Brian, not just a day of sorrow, but a day of symbols. The Pentagon hit, of course, on 9/11, and half of the cost since that day on these 10 years generated from this building as we fought in wars around the world. Brian?
David, thank you. And as we go on up north, back here to New York, the governor of New York, Governor Cuomo.
Everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from want everywhere in the world. The fourth is freedom from fear anywhere in the world. That is our goal, and our strength is in our unity of purpose. To that high concept, there can be no end save victory.
My name is James Smith, retired New York City police officer. 5 years ago, with my daughter Patricia at my side, I told you about my wife and Patricia's mother, Police Officer Moira Smith, who ran into the towers time and time again to save as many people as she possibly could. Moira sacrificed all that she had and all the richness of life that still lay in front of her in order to save just one more person. Moira was killed when the South Tower collapsed. Since that time, Patricia has grown and blossomed into a lovely 12-year-old, the very picture of her mother, with her mom's smile and a sense of adventure. Our family has grown. Patricia now has 2 little brothers to share her zest for life. 5 years ago, we looked back and gave words to our sorrow. Today, we choose to remember and share the joy Moira brought to all of us. And we vow that she will always live in our hearts.
Mom, I am proud to be your daughter. You will always be my hero and the pride of New York City.
Well, the sun is surely sinking down, but the moon is slowly rising. So this whole world must still be spinning around, and I still love you. So close your eyes. You can close your eyes, it's all right. I don't know no love songs, and I can't sing the blues anymore, but I can sing this song, and you can sing this song when I'm gone. Long before another day. Yeah, we're gonna have a good time, and no one's gonna take that time away. You can stay as long as you like, only close your eyes. You can close your eyes, it's all right. No, I don't know no love songs, I can't sing the blues anymore. Sure, but I can sing this song, and you can sing this song when I'm gone.
Manuel Joao de Mota.
Patrick W. Denahi.
And in honor of my brother Frederick John Cox, on behalf of his mother, his sister, and his father.
Beautiful job by James Taylor, part of the emotional ongoing day here as the parade of names continues. Again, it's when you're dealing with the gravity and the length, 3,000 names here alone in New York. Tom Brokaw is here with one of the many stories that came out of 9/11.
One of the things that happened, Brian, as you well know, is that the military was reconfigured. We now hear a lot more after the fact about Special Operations Delta Force, and recently, again, the Navy SEALs, who had a tragic loss recently in Afghanistan. They were the people who went in and got Osama bin Laden. We have the story of a man by the name of Jim Smith, who was a SEAL on that day and was thinking maybe he ought to retire. So I spent some time with him recently because he now runs the Navy SEAL Foundation, which we'll talk about in a moment. Where were you on 9/11 that morning?
I was fishing on the Hudson River with my brother-in-law, Mike. I was discussing retiring from SEAL teams at 20 years. That's where I was on 9/11, watching the buildings tumble that as a child I watched built over years, and then in hours you watch them tumble.
And you changed your mind?
I don't even remember changing my mind. My mind was changed for me.
You went back on active duty after that day of fishing?
I did.
Did you go to Afghanistan?
I deployed as was required.
Answered like a true SEAL. No more information than is necessary.
Missions, not words, define this elite fighting force.
The bonding that goes on with the SEALs and the determination to stay out of the limelight is profound.
Our friendship, our camaraderie, and all that are forged through adversity. Absolutely forged through adversity. When you're going through SEAL training, you have a boat on your head for 6 months. You're in cold water, and you'll often watch a class of 175 solid young men dwindle to 25.
1, 2, 3, up!
So that forging starts early. And so many of these men that are my brothers, they are fighting this fight so their children don't have to.
The Navy SEALs were front and center on the biggest triumph of the last several years, and that is going in, finding Osama bin Laden, executing him, and getting home safely. What did you think when you saw all that?
Well, when I first heard the news, like the average American, I was pleased. It was a national victory.
After his retirement from the SEALs in April of this year, Smith accepted a new mission to lead the Navy SEAL Foundation, which provides everything from financial and educational help to grief counseling for SEAL families. On August 6th, when 17 SEALs, along with 13 other servicemen and a dog, were killed in the crash of a helicopter on a mission in eastern Afghanistan, back home, the SEAL Foundation went to duty stations.
You expect it from your teammates. Through the worst of things, you see the best in people.
Does the rest of this country understand what's going on? The remainder of the civilian population outside the military ranks?
Due to the recent outpouring of gratitude that we've seen after this tragedy, I would say more know now than did a month ago. My optimistic side says yes, these guys are not going to stop. They're in for the long haul, and support to them is more important now than ever.
That's another dimension to our lives, Brian, is that we have foundations to support these special forces. And as we speak in Coronado, California, Bill Wilson is the captain of the training center there, has another class in the water at this hour, doing the equivalent of carrying a boat on their heads for 2 marathons during Hell Week. So we have an entirely different military in a lot of ways. And Jim Smith is emblematic of that.
And each team gets a log in the water. And to a point you always make, Americans look at these clips of training as a novelty, not to be too flip about it, compared to the all-in involvement after World War II. Now with our volunteer force, most people in happy, healthy civilian life in America don't have a kid or a dad or a mom in this fight.
You don't get drafted. You have to step up. You have to volunteer to do it. And so many of them come from our working class and middle class and not from people who really represent the elite of America and the higher income groups. Nothing is asked of the rest of us. I think that's, if not a failure, a greatly missed opportunity of the last 10 years.
And one we can't point out often enough. Tom Brokaw, thanks, and thanks to the Navy SEALs and the Navy SEAL Foundation. Back to Washington and David Gregory. David?
And to the Pentagon ceremony here, Brian, the Battle Hymn of the Republic as this ceremony continues. We're about to hear from Vice President Biden.
Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on.
watching the Pentagon ceremony here honoring those fallen after Flight 77 struck the west side of the Pentagon, the site of the memorial itself. In just a moment, we will hear from Vice President Biden, who will allude to something that's so personal for him, and that is getting a call out of the blue to hear such horrific news that he went through in his own life as he identifies with the victims of September 11th. Secretary of Defense Panetta speaking now, and Jim Miklashevsky, our Pentagon correspondent. I was recently at General David Petraeus' retirement ceremony, and he talked as the former commander of Afghanistan and Iraq of our troops about how the military has changed in the course of 2 wars since the attacks.
Well, there's no question about it. You can see the transformation immediately after 9/11. They went from a big footprint military with huge tanks and artillery to a much smaller, more agile force, spearheaded in large part by the Special Operations Forces, which have grown exponentially. They've been so critical in taking down many of these terrorist targets at night, in silence, unheralded. Nevertheless, they are doing a tremendous job.
And Andrea Mitchell, as we await the Vice President, Al-Qaeda hit us on 9/11. The state of Al-Qaeda today is what?
Al-Qaeda is diminished. I don't think there's any question that the top leadership, not only bin Laden, but key operatives have been diminished, but it has metastasized. And now we have Al-Qaeda offshoots, most principally in Yemen and Somalia and elsewhere, who are very, very dangerous, perhaps not as organizationally adept, but can still hit us, given the current threat outlook right now. I think the state of our intelligence community has radically shifted. A lot of criticism still, but when you look back at the 9/11 Commission report, what is not done has been pointed out, but what has been done has been considerable.
And Jim Miklashevsky, as we await Vice President Biden here in the course of this Pentagon ceremony, we also think about the fact that we do appear to be in a state of perpetual war. 10 years on, the United States is still trying to figure out how wars in Iraq and Afghanistan really end.
There's no question about it. And all the active duty and retired military experts that I've talked to, just over the past 3-4 months, they're all talking about not the end of the war in Afghanistan, not the end of the war in Iraq, but they're talking about a perpetual battle against this kind of militancy that they believe will stretch through at least the first half of this century. We're talking about another 30, 40 years of this kind of war, not in these kinds of numbers, but certainly that America is going to be on a defensive and offensive military footing for the next 30, 40 years, they think.
It's daunting to think about, Andrea. Daunting as we hear this plane overhead, and Brian made this observation when speaking to President Obama yesterday. We still live in this city where proximity to some of our major institutions and to those buildings, the Pentagon, the White House, are still very, very vulnerable, and yet there has not been another large-scale attack since 9/11. We spoke to Karen Hughes earlier. Those protections that have put in place have hardened the target of the United States.
They've changed our lives and diminished our lives and our access, but have protected us. And knock on wood, I'm superstitious enough, we haven't had another attack, but I think that the lone wolf could still do a huge amount of damage. We haven't talked enough probably about weapons of mass destruction and our vulnerabilities, the tunnels, the trains, we all know about that. And the fact, as Lee Hamilton and Tom Keane, the co-chairs of 9/11 Commission pointed out the other day, we're not communicating as well as we need to still with local responders.
Jim, I want to bring it back also to memory and to honoring those who were killed here, 184. There is this difference in scale between New York and here, and it was easy for the attacks on the Pentagon, as symbolically important as it was, to be overshadowed by virtue of what happened in New York.
And one would think that perhaps people here at the Pentagon would resent that somewhat, but it's just the opposite. The remarkable thing about 9/11 is even as this building was on fire, as the rescue and recovery efforts were still underway, just across the other side of the building, senior military and Pentagon officials were in the tank, the National Military Command Center, already planning the war. They did not stop to take a breath, to feel sorry for themselves in the least little bit. They all got down to work to try to not only defend on that day, but understand what ramification, what was going to be required in the months and years ahead.
We talk about the costs, Andrea, of the response to 9/11. More than half of what's estimated to be over $3 trillion in this past decade was to fight this nation's wars, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. It's staggering to think about that level of cost as the debate went on throughout and continues today, whether it was the right reaction.
And we still haven't fully calculated the expense of protection and of the other intelligence that we don't know about, what is unseen, and the black operations that are all part of that as well. So that is a very big number, and it is a number many would argue that right now our vulnerability is economic. And our weakness is economically structural, and that we spent a decade on the military side, but we didn't look more deeply at how we were not dealing with, all the things that we discuss, the entitlements and everything else that have just expanded beyond belief.
Certainly. As we approach a fourth moment of silence within a couple of minutes, Jim Miklaszewski, we talk about the response to 9/11 from people who volunteered to serve. We have an all-volunteer force, but you can't say enough how a generation of warriors were prepared for this moment when they would be called. That's part of what living in the military is like. You prepare, and then a moment like this comes.
That's exactly right. I mean, the response to this was remarkably swift. Unfortunately, it wasn't decisive, and that still remains the problem today.
Yeah. We are approaching another milestone this morning as we look back 10 years later. We're going to throw it back to Brian up in New York.
All of it is a tough business, David, and the next event here is going to be at 9:59, as you mentioned, to mark the moment when the South Tower fell. Remember, second structure hit first to fall here in New York, as we all watched on television in collective disbelief. And then, of course, at 10:03, that was the moment of impact in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Let's listen in to the reading of the names prior to the moment of silence.
Family's loved one who we miss and love very much, Janine Damiani Jones.
And from my amazing father, Anthony Denisio Jr., we love and miss you so very much. Keep watching over us, handsome.
Today, as you look over the walls of remembrance, we want to share with you the words of the poet Mary Lee Hall, who wrote, "Turn again to life. If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like others sore undone, who keep long vigil by the silent dust. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort other hearts than thine. Complete these dear unfinished tasks of mine, and I, perchance, may therein comfort you."
from the sad scene in New York, we take you to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where their only moment of silence has to do with the 10:03 a.m. impact of Flight 93. The deaths on 9/11 were equal. That was all part of the largest mass murder we'd ever seen. Some died being ordinary citizens. Some died because they showed up to work early. Some died because they went in to rescue others. Others died as heroes. Folks who woke up that day with a business trip in mind, people who woke up that day and reported to work as pilots and flight attendants. And the families of 9/11 have made their way throughout American society in the years since. What we have for you next is part of a personal story for us at NBC News. With the arrival of the summer interns this past summer of 2011, we got to know one very nice young man named Charlie Green. After getting to know him, someone took me aside and some others and said, you know, Charlie is a 9/11 kid. He lost his father, Donald, on impact United Airlines Flight 93 in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. A short time ago, we saw Charlie do his time at the podium in Shanksville. And earlier, we sat down with Charlie to hear the story of Flight 93, his father, and his experience in his own words.
Hey, Charles! My father, Don Green, was on United Flight 93. Flying was totally his thing. That's what he did for a living. He was involved in the aviation industry. His father was a pilot. He learned to fly when he was 14 before he had his driver's license. It was his passion. He was the one who could have landed that plane. And I know in the bottom of my heart that if he could have been up in that cockpit, he would have been, and he would have landed that plane safely. We've always said that the sum of each individual passenger's legacy is nowhere near as great as the influence they had on this country as they boarded that flight, became one and took a tremendous risk. They acted when it's hard to tell if any of us would have done the same thing. When we go to Shanksville, we have to deal with those 40 people who came together and did something so great, and then people wanting to memorialize that action. But we also have to deal with our individual loss. I lost my dad. Throughout the past 10 years, I've tried to think more of these anniversaries as less of remembering a loss and more of remembering a life. When he was my age, he lost his mother, shortly thereafter lost his father. So I've always seen his life as a source of courage for me. If he could do it, if he got to where he was, a man that I looked so much up to, then I could get that too. I've always said that I'd rather have him for the first 10 years of my life, setting up the foundation for the rest of my life, than anything else. And I consider myself so lucky to have had that for the amount of time that I did. You know, one of the things that I like to do is, as these anniversaries come and go, is to think, you know, if he was still here, what would he think of where I am right now? You know, that's been something that's kept me strong, and hopefully he'd be proud of where I am, where my family is, and, you know, I think he would.
Again, we met Charlie Green this summer. There was his time today at the podium in Shanksville. We knew him only as a bright, well-educated kid from Greenwich, Connecticut, with a good work ethic, always had a smile, always willing to do anything the newsroom required. And then we learned the story of Charlie Green and his loss on 9/11. Back down to Washington, to the Pentagon, where Vice President Joe Biden
American people that we see come to the fore in our darkest hours. An instinct that echoes through the ages, from Pearl Harbor to Beirut, from Mogadishu to Ground Zero, to Flight 93 to right here in the Pentagon. Those in this building that day knew what they were witnessing. It was a declaration of war by stateless actors bent on changing our way of life, who believed that these horrible acts of terror directed against innocents, could buckle our knees, could bend our will, could begin to break us and break our resolve. But they did not know us. Instead, that same American instinct that sent all of you into the breach between the 4th and 5th corridors galvanized an entire new generation of patriots, the 9/11 generation. Many of them were just kids on that bright September morning. But like their grandparents, on December 7th, 1941, they courageously bore the burden that history had placed on their shoulders. And as they came of age, they showed up. They showed up to fight for their country, and they're still showing up. 2,800,000 of that 9/11 generation moved to join our military since the attacks on 9/11 to finish the war begun here that day. And they joined. They joined knowing that they were in all likelihood going to be deployed in harm's way, and many cases deployed multiple times in Afghanistan and Iraq and other dangerous parts of the world. Those of you, Admiral, who command this building, turn this generation, this 9/11 generation, into the finest group of warriors the world has ever known. Over a decade of war, they pioneered new tactics, mastered new language, developed and employed advanced new technologies. They took on responsibilities once reserved only for those with considerably more seniority, responsibilities that extended beyond the base or the battlefield, to the politics of Afghanistan, to the politics of Iraq, to the economies of those countries, and to the development tasks that ultimately will lay the groundwork for us to leave behind stable, countries that will not threaten us. And along with the intelligence community and the law enforcement community, they relentlessly took the fight to al-Qaeda and its affiliates. They were prepared to follow bin Laden to Hell's Gate if necessary, and they got him. My God, do we owe those special ops folks and intelligence guys who got him, many of whom have subsequently lost their lives. But we will not stop. You will not stop until Al-Qaeda is not only disrupted, but completely dismantled and ultimately destroyed. And one more thing about this 9/11 generation of warriors. Never before in our history has America asked so much over such a sustained period of an all-volunteer force. So I can say without fear of contradiction or being accused of exaggeration, the 9/11 generation ranks among the greatest our nation has ever produced, and it was born right here on 9/11. And as the Admiral said, that generation has paid an incredible price. 4,478 fallen angels in Iraq, 1,648 in Afghanistan, and more than 40,000 wounded in both countries, some of whom will require care and support the rest of their lives. Having visited them multiple times like many of you, I am awed, not only by their capability, but their sacrifices today and every day. The terrorists who attacked the Pentagon, as Leon said, sought to weaken America by shattering this defining symbol of our military might and prowess. But they failed. And they also failed for another reason, not just physically failed. They failed because they continue to fundamentally misunderstand us as they misunderstood us on that day. For the true source of American power is not
emotional speech by the Vice President. We wanted to bring you as much of that as we could. And, of course, he speaks from experience, his son Bo having served as a reservist in the Judge Adjutant General's office in Iraq. Also at the Pentagon at this hour, David Gregory is with author and presidential historian and friend of NBC News, Doris Kearns Goodwin. David?
Thanks, Brian. Also mom of that member of the 9/11 generation. We talked about it on Meet the Press last week, your son Joseph, who did feel compelled to enlist and served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. For him, as he expressed it, and for you, there was that change. This was a new generation born after these attacks.
I mean, no question. I mean, I think my son Joe would say that however difficult those services were in those two countries, it changed his life in a fundamentally way for the good. Here's a kid growing up in affluent Concord, saw a world he never would have seen, brought 30 kids through safely. He said the proudest thing in his life will be that his 30 platoon members got through that war without dying. What else can you say about that, to be proud as a person, as I am, of that kid?
As you look at the broad sweep of history, not just as a mom, but as an historian, how do we define this decade?
Well, it's always easier as an historian to do it 40 years later, but I'll have to do it now. It's probably not as tidy as we think. Maybe some beginning is al-Qaeda, the ending is the killing of Osama bin Laden. Mm-hmm. There's a certain sense in which the military, as I think the Vice President was just saying, will be the most respected institution of this decade. And that's a terrific change from Vietnam, where we didn't distinguish between the war and the warriors. Even though these wars became controversial, we still respected, thank God, the military. There's also a sense of resilience that our country went through this and still remains strong. On the other hand, there's lost opportunities. I think historians will look at this decade, what might have been had we focused on involving more people in this war so that these kids didn't have to do multiple duties. And there's a sense of recklessness about the decade, reckless home mortgages, reckless bankers, reckless government. and a sense of sadness about the decade. That's why this is such a good anniversary now, to remember that moment of unity when things might have been possible that turned out not to be.
Moments of unity. It reminded us this week, and we have the image of members of Congress coming together to sing on the steps of the Capitol. That was such a moment of America's unity. God bless America. To see a Democrat and a Republican today, 10 years later, at ground zero, both of whom have had huge parts in our response to 9/11. Historians deal with memory. Why is memory important 10 years later? Why is how we remember an event like this important?
You know, I think historical anniversaries are mostly about stories. They're about stories of events that happened in the past that create the contours of the present. We got to hope that we, the living, can learn from the triumphs and failures of those stories. But even more fundamentally, it's stories about people who died, particularly on this particular day. To the extent we bring them back now, they live on in the memory of others. I think it's all of our hopes that somehow, through the memories of our grandparents and our parents, we can make those people who died live on for our children and grandchildren. That's what history is about. That's why I love it so much. The idea that you really can recreate by telling stories the people who lived before and learn from their example.
But isn't it interesting that after World War II even, the notion of perpetual war, perpetual vigilance is very difficult for people. And in our country, Senator John McCain of Arizona just said it this morning. He can understand, despite the needs that we have overseas in two wars that we're still fighting as a result of 9/11, so many Americans do want to shift the focus. They want to focus back on home because of what our economy is going through, because of what as a country we're going through, in part because of how expensive it was in all manner of lives and money to respond to these horrible events.
You know, one of the things Eleanor Roosevelt said during World War II was that if we're going to be fighting for democracy abroad, we have to strengthen it at home. And one of the great things about World War II, which is why people look back on it and feel such a sense of pride, is that not only did we fight those terrible wars abroad, but we became stronger at home. A giant middle class was formed. Labor got stronger. Business was revived. The home front mobilized to produce the ships, the tanks, the weapons. Everybody participated in that war, and we became a stronger country. I think that's the difficulty now. Not only is there no end result, because this war keeps going on. You don't even have the end of the Cold War to value. We at least saw that wall come down. We saw the Soviet Union fracture. There's no clear ending to this. And in the meantime, we didn't strengthen our country at home. More inequality of income than we had when we began. The end of World War II, that pyramidal structure was overturned, and we were strong.
How important is it to grapple with what the reaction was, whether it was an overreaction to what we saw, which is, of course, part of the debate now, as it's been for at least 5 years?
Well, I mean, clearly one thing, as I think President Bush has said and can continue to say, is he saw the purpose of his presidency as protecting America from another attack. We don't know what might have happened if that incredible changes in our intelligence structure, our security structure, had not produced the safety that we felt in the last 10 years. On the other hand, I know some of our friends in Europe say we're used to these kind of things more than you are, and we've gone on with our lives in a way that we, because we were so stunned by it, may have overreacted. But I don't think we'll ever know that, since we don't know what was prevented from happening.
And that's a big part of it, isn't it? That we have not been attacked on that order as we were 10 years ago today since that point.
That's right.
And we all live with the recognition that were it to happen, that in fact it could change the country once again. Doris, thank you very much
You're so welcome.
for your thoughts this morning. Brian, back to you in New York.
David, there's something about hearing it from Doris. We all know the facts and we live the generation, and yet in her hands and in her words, she's right, and it all makes sense. David Gregory with Doris Kearns Goodwin down at the Pentagon. Thanks. We also wanted to show you something else. Yesterday afternoon, we flew down to Washington. I spent some time with the president, who entered the White House having just returned from something very solemn, part of his 9/11 duty, you might say. The president and the first lady went to a part of Arlington National Cemetery called Section 60, where this nation's war dead, as a result of our current dual wars, are laid to rest. I talked to him about that and about this event. I came from New York this morning. This is the That's the front page of the Post, and there's the unveiling of the memorial, the names, and yet in front of it is a police officer with an automatic weapon. Automatic weapons all over the city this weekend. Right. Does that kind of sum up where we are here 10 years later?
Well, there's no doubt that we are safer now than we were 10 years ago. And that's thanks to the incredible work that's been done by intelligence, by our military, by the sacrifice of the 9/11 generation that's served in Afghanistan and Iraq. As a consequence of both more effective homeland security, as well as taking the fight to al-Qaeda, we are in a much stronger position now than we were then. And al-Qaeda is on the path to defeat. We've taken out huge chunks of their senior leadership, most prominently, obviously, Osama bin Laden. But there are still people out there who would try to hurt Americans, who would try to strike at us, and we have to be constantly vigilant.
We've been told this threat we're under now is specific, credible, and unconfirmed.
Right.
What must you choose not to act on of all the traffic you see, and what do these three words mean when taken together? What are we supposed to do?
Well, I think the most important thing the American people should know is that for months we've been preparing for this 9/11 anniversary. Obviously, each 9/11 we start seeing threat streams coming up. The fact that this is the 10th anniversary means that we're seeing more of these threat streams coming up. And so for months now we've been preparing all the agencies, Department of Homeland Security, the CIA, all of our intelligence folks have been pulling threads, making sure that we understood what potential threats might be out there. One particular threat was specific enough and credible enough that we felt it necessary to inform state and local partners so that they could also be prepared. But all the work that's been done over the last several months means that we have done what we need to do in order to take the greatest precaution in dealing with this potential threat. That doesn't mean, though, that we shouldn't be vigilant. And what we want all Americans to know is, although your government has prepared for it, it's important for everybody to keep their eyes open. You should go about doing what you were planning to do on 9/11 anyway. We have to honor those who have been fallen, but people should be on the lookout and make sure that if something suspicious is taking place, that you're informing your local law enforcement.
Tell me about Section 60 and what happens to you and Mrs. Obama when you're there.
It's interesting. What's so powerful as you walk through Section 60, for those who aren't aware, that's primarily where our fallen from the Iraq and Afghanistan campaigns are buried in Arlington. We're always struck by how young everybody is there. These kids were in their 20s. For the most part. And not only are you struck by the incredible sacrifice that were made by the fallen, but you also have an opportunity to thank directly young men and women who are still serving on our behalf, still helping to make America more secure. It's a reminder that our way of life is dependent on the incredible courage, the incredible patriotism of a whole host of people from all across the country, every walk of life, every ethnicity, every religion. It's a somber moment when you think about all these young people who gave their lives so young.
We caught the president yesterday at an emotional and reflective time. Tom Brokaw's here with us. And Tom, we just heard it again. We're under full alert here and in Washington. But go on about your business. Last night in this part of the city, it was just police cars cruising either fast or slowly. There are people who just want to touch this event and be part of it being held back because of the security. Someone had the bad idea of a fireworks display over the Hudson, and those concussions scared everyone in Lower Manhattan, and people went to their windows. It's an on-edge environment 10 years later.
Well, it's a tough mix for Ray Kelly, our friend who's the police commissioner here, but he's done a remarkable job of allowing the city to get on with its daily life. Occasions like this, people are not being stopped by magnetometers and a lot of things, but his big effort has been to put a massive amount of police on the streets. Nonetheless, we've been very lucky. Remember, there was a car parked in the middle of Times Square by what turned out to be a clumsy bomber, a man who was trying to get back to Pakistan. and see something, say something, a street vendor called the police because there was smoke coming out of that car. What if that had been a clever bomber? And that's the big worry in intel now, is that you have the lone wolf, somebody who is depressed or not getting enough attention. They want to be a part of this madness that is still going on in too many parts of the world. And how you can ever completely protect against that, Brian, is an enormous dilemma.
And for a large part of last night, as you look at one of the many checkpoints, barricades, they're stopping cabs, they're stopping trucks, some cars randomly, all the bridges and tunnels. For a large part of last night, they were looking for a rental truck. For part of yesterday, 2 to 3 rental trucks. And now for the final moment of silence, 10:28, marking the falling of the North Tower. The first hit, second to fall. We'll go back to ground zero below us.
The perspective that we need and have needed to get through the last 10 years and the years that remain are best expressed by the words of God as inscribed in the book of Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to win and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. God bless every soul that we lost. God bless the family members who have to endure that loss. And God guide us to our reunion in heaven. And God bless the United States of America.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Epps. It has been 10 years, and it feels like it just happened yesterday. My brother, Christopher Epps, worked on the 98th floor in the North Tower. Not one holiday, birthday has gone by that my 4 sisters and my brother and I don't think about him. Our mother never takes off a necklace with this picture in it. Something I have learned over the past 10 years is that people come forward to help you in your time of need. And today, we thank you. The people of our great nation, family, friends, and neighbors. At work, Christopher sat next to his good friend, Wayne Russo. The Russo family has made a special request that their son's name be placed next to my brother's name. That meant so much to our family. What I know now is that the forces of good are not just in movies. It's all around us. People really do catch you when you fall. It's been a blessing. Christopher would have loved knowing that the love he freely gave to others was given back to us in his name. Thank you, and I bid you Godspeed.
darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again, because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping, and the vision that was planted in my brain still remains within the sound of silence. In restless dreams I walked alone, narrow streets of cobblestone, beneath the halo of a street lamp. I turned my collar to the cold and the damp, when my eyes were stabbed by the flash of a neon light that split the night and touched the sound of silence. And in the naked light I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never shared, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Fool, said I, you do not know, silence like a cancer grows. Hear my words that I might teach you, take my arms that I might reach out to you, but my words, like silent raindrops, fell and echoed in the wells of silence, and the people bowed and prayed sign flashed its warning, and the words that it was forming. It said the words of the prophet are written on the subway walls and tenement halls, and whispered in the sound of silence.
Kevin James Hannaford Sr.
Michael Lawrence Hannon.
Dana Ray Hannon.
We're here with Tom Brokaw listening to Paul Simon. If you don't think the emotion is still raw,
Sue Kim.
That just kills him.
Well, you hear from America's troubadours, James Taylor and Paul Simon, and there are other musical events. Last night, New York Philharmonic taped their memorial concert, Mahler's Symphony No. 2, Resurrection, which is appropriate. This weekend, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir has its own memorial concert. Music is such a critical part of these kinds of ceremonies. It evokes memories, it speaks to us in ways that our everyday language cannot. That's a fireman's helmet.
Yeah, from Ladder 10, right across the way here. And these names, Tom, the etchings, people just touching them, have become the subplot of today as the families are just getting their first exposure to make these rubbings, to have something to hold on to.
You know, that concept really came out of the Vietnam Memorial, and it has become, in many ways, a template for other memorials. I know when I go there, where I have friends on that wall, I feel connected to them. And plainly, these families do as well and will forevermore. It's the most tangible evidence that they have of the presence of their lost loved ones at this site in so many instances because of the violence of the destruction.
It's a debt of gratitude we owe the architect Maya Lin for the simplicity of the idea back then. Our live coverage will continue after a break. Back as our coverage of this sad anniversary day continues. This part of Lower Manhattan, we've been speaking of it as an event, but also as a landmark. It's a neighborhood, of course, where people live and work. And it was a terrible day here 10 years ago, a terrible day for children who go to school near here 10 years ago today. Rahema Ellis covers education for us, and she's here with a look back and really a look forward for these kids, Rahema.
For sure. On that day, about 9,000 children were in several schools around here on the day of the attacks. So many of them are all grown up now, but they still have very vivid memories of the tragedy that unfolded just outside their classrooms. Back to school at New York City's PS 234, a school marked by being in the shadow of history.
We heard the boom. We heard the plane crash, and then our teacher said it's probably construction.
Over the years, National Geographic Kids has documented what happened to these children.
It's September 11th, 2001.
Teacher Pat Carney's classroom was just 4 blocks from the World Trade Towers. September 11th was a day seared in the memories of Ian Slade Tullis and his fellow 4th graders.
For them, the events didn't happen at Ground Zero. They happened in their neighborhood.
Hannah Moak remembered her mother, very upset, suddenly came to take her out of school.
She was still crying when we sat down on the train, so I had a sweater, and I started wiping her makeup, which was now
floating down her face.
What happened just a few blocks from here on the morning of September 11th profoundly impacted students' lives and helped shape who they have become. Hannah and Ian, children of 9/11, are young adults today.
I remember we were sitting right there.
Hannah is a college sophomore, majoring in journalism and documentary filmmaking.
On 9/11, my mother turned to me and she said, you have to look at this because this is history. From that point on, I really understood that when things happen, you have to stop and pay attention.
Ian, also in college, is concentrating on environmental studies.
Every time I hear a plane going over me, no matter where it is, I will look and stare at that plane for maybe 10 seconds. Or if I hear a really loud sound, I have to take a moment to think about what that might be.
Contrary to what some might expect, he says September 11th made him more tolerant.
I've grown and learned from 9/11, especially in the ways that I think about other people.
So now who do we have here?
Pat Carney, still teaching at PS 234, is proud of the young adults her fourth graders have become.
I remember back, though, pretty well how scary it was for them, but how strong the kids were at the time about it, how matter of fact they were about it. And, you know, when I see them now, they seem to have gotten through it.
It definitely put a big before and after in our lives.
For Hannah and Ian, even though 10 years have passed, they say there's no such thing as closure, at least not yet. But still, both say they now have learned to live without fear. And Ian told me that 10 years ago, when he was still a child, all he could think about was running and not looking back. But now, like so many others, Brian, he says it's important to remember and take stock of where we are as a country.
Amazing to see. They grew up okay and they're resilient.
They were very resilient then and now.
And I'm with him. The airplane thing has
still
changed
scary.
It forever. It has. Raheem Ellis, thank you for your report. We're back with more right after this. We're back here from the 10th anniversary ceremonies, Ground Zero, New York. There are so many stories we could bring you. There's a story walking around with every person visiting here today. One we did want to highlight, a man named Richard Cabo. He works for the New York City Parks Department, and he tells the story today about a survivor down here on the plaza, often overlooked by people visiting the city, but no less important to New Yorkers.
My name is Richie Cabo, and I'm the director of the Citywide Nursery in Van Cortlandt Park for the New York City Department of Parks. Yeah, the tree was called the 9/11 Survivor Tree. The tree actually was found by the workers when they were cleaning up around Ground Zero, and it was about a month after the attacks that it was first noticed. There was nothing left of the tree. It was only like 1 or 2 branches and a few leaves. And when I first saw the tree, I didn't think that the tree was going to make it. It looked like a wounded soldier. It just looked like it had been through a war, and it was just a very intense moment. You know, I think for all New Yorkers, it was a very touchy time. We wouldn't have any way of knowing if the tree was going to make it until the following spring. So when the spring came, we noticed the buds coming out. We knew the tree was still alive, and that was a good feeling. The tree was with us for 9 years, and I'm getting a little emotional just thinking about it. We just tied and bonded with the tree, and when people would come up to see it, you would feel the emotions. And the other thing about the tree, which I guess you could compare it to everybody, it's that when you look at the tree from one side, it looks perfect and beautiful if you're standing far away. But if you stand on the other side, you can see the scars and the new growth. You can see how it really struggled to survive. You know, it's just like us. We just keep growing, but it wasn't easy. It symbolized how New York was so tough and was able to bounce back. It symbolized how America is still struggling to bounce back even today, but we're still doing it and we're bouncing back and we don't give up.
So just like some of the people who lived through what happened here, the tree had to go away to get better and is now back, just as so many people have come back, touching this, some of them, for the first time. Tom Brokaw here with me in New York, David Gregory down at the Pentagon, and Tom, starting with you. 10 years ago right now, we had lost both buildings. We really didn't have our arms yet around the size of the tragedy or the disaster.
people forget. I certainly remember that time. We thought that there may be as many as 30,000 people still left in those buildings. The mayor thought that at the time. They did a remarkable job getting as many people out as they did. I remember saying on the air that this is going to be a different country from now on. I had no kind of clear vision about where we were going to go, but I knew that this would profoundly change us. And it has in so many ways, Brian, not just the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but in the meantime, China has become the second most powerful economy in the world. We're competing in a different economic environment now. We've had a big transition politically. The first African-American president was elected. He now has found his own difficulties with the American economy. We're trying to decide what our future is in the 21st century. There's a very robust debate going on here. So the chain reaction, as I said at the beginning of this morning, continues. I do hope that this ceremony and the speeches that we've heard, the wonderful moving music of Paul Simon, will give us all pause to think about how can we come together again, and more broadly speaking, to get on with what we know are the big challenges of the 21st century.
And David Gregory, as you point out, there where you are, you have a building that bore the scar of one prong of this attack, and a building where, as it was still smoldering, inside the confines of the E-ring of the Pentagon, they were planning the military action that has become our nation's longest conflict.
And it's remarkable to think, Brian, just how prepared our nation's armed forces were at that moment. Before they were esteemed in the same way that I think they have been since 9/11 and on everyone's lips. We had a volunteer force that was ready to go, ready to serve, ready to deploy, and they're still deploying. And how our armed forces have changed so remarkably in the past decade. How they train differently, how they are fighting wars differently, engaging the enemy and allies differently, and I think that's a profound part of this as well as we move forward. And I just want to pick up on one other thing. There's to me, there's a symbol in my own life. My oldest son is 9 and asks me about 9/11, and he knows about it. There are details that we share, but yet more to come. And I think that's a big part of it. We continue to elevate the victims, elevate their lives. We talk about it, we learn more, but we grapple with it. We reckon with our response over the last decade, and I think that's part of that process of moving on.
Tom, David Gregory talks about the fact that our force was ready, but let's be candid, we didn't always give them what they deserved. They were driving around Iraq and Afghanistan without the armor they needed, without the force protection that this incredible volunteer army deserved.
Well, they were not prepared for the kind of war that we had to fight, quite honestly. We had big aircraft carriers and we had nuclear weapons, but we were fighting guerrilla war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And the IED was something that was not on anyone's vocabulary, even in the Pentagon before that. The improvised explosive device, which became a terribly lethal weapon over there. Something else that needs to be said, it seems to me, about the military and the response. And the National Guard is no longer in any way a second-class military establishment. A lot of them have deployed downrange 2 and 3 times. They've paid a terrible price. It's made the Guard a much stronger unit and a place where people want to go to become actively involved in the military. There has been, as David said, a real reconfiguration of everything, and it's a reminder to this country that for all of our power, we have to be constantly in a state of renewal of our values, of our institutions, of our security. It's a much smaller planet now, and there are many more people, and we have to be aware of where we fit in.
Tom Brokaw, David Gregory, thank you, partner. I appreciate it. It is clouded up here over Ground Zero. That's probably a good thing because we didn't need yet another reminder of a September 11th here 10 years later. It all sadly started here, and it all continues today. As we look back on 10 years, we want to just take a moment and look back at our coverage of today, of what we've seen unfold as we leave you some of the sights and sounds of this morning.
cannot refrain from tendering to you the consolation that may be found in the thanks of the Republic they died to save.
And my father, James Patrick Berger.
Dira Francis Bodley.
Bruce Douglas Bone.
Richard Edward Bosco.
Klaus Botha.
We love you, Dad. Me, Nick, Alan, Mom will never forget you.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
God bless every soul that we lost. God bless the family members who have to endure that loss. And God, guide us to our reunion in heaven. And God bless the United States of America.